Chapter 23. Everything happened so quickly now that there was no time for thought. My breath was knocked out of me as I hit the ground, and as I rolled and twisted under the cabin, a stone slashed my knee, and something reached down from above to gouge at my cheek. Yet I felt nothing, not even terror. I just kept rolling until I banged up against one of the pilings that held up the cabin. Wedged against this, I sprawled flat on my belly. I was in a low, dark crawl space. 6 inches above my head were the floorboards of the cabin. On either side were assorted bits of junk and debris. Old boards, a rake, a screen, a splintered scrap of plywood that cut at my hand. And all I could see in front of me was a maze of pilings and the narrow strip of light where the foundation ended. And then another shot rang out, and I pressed my face into a puddle of mud and dead leaves. Somewhere over my head the shot smashed through the cabin, the sound feeding back with a nasty whine. I began wiggling back even farther till my head hit a joist. That stopped me, and then I listened for a moment. Subotin was calling something, but I couldn't hear what it was. And as I peered at that gray strip of light, all I could see were the stalks of dead grass around the foundation. Now came 2 more shots, quick, one on top of the other, and I wormed back some more. Sensing light behind me, I began slewing around. A cobweb stickily matted over my mouth. I pushed an old bucket out of my way, but then I scrambled ahead, elbows working madly, and rolled into the open. I pulled myself up, and just then a voice hissed, "Thorn? Is it you?" I spun around, almost more startled by this than by the shots, but then I realized it was Brightman, on the other side of the wall. There was no window, but he was whispering, his lips pressed to the crack. "Listen, he thinks you are me. He must. Run, get into the trees. There's a path that takes you down to the stream. Stay in the stream. Hurry." I could scarcely understand this. I was too confused, but even as my brain fought to get control of my tongue, I heard Brightman rolling away and sensed Subotin on the far side of the cabin, making his dash through the clearing. I looked up. The dark, oysterish light swam and pulsed in front of my eyes. Here, behind the cabin, the clearing continued for perhaps 50 yards, the black massed shadows of the trees beckoning beyond. There was no time to think, to decide. I just started to run, running for my life, head down, lungs gasping, one step fleeing another, leaping over rocks, blundering through bushes. I barely knew where I was going, for in the dying light the world had lost all definition. Everything floated in murk. Space itself had discovered new rules. Before me, the safe shadow of the forest seemed to retreat forever, like a mirage. But vague, remote forms suddenly came into focus an inch away from my face. The bare bones of a birch, the bright beaded pattern of a spider's web, a withered seed pod hanging from a bush. And in the same way, even as I began to feel I was running through a hopeless dream, the dark trees suddenly reached out and grabbed me. Only then did I allow myself a single look back. The clearing was empty. At once, taking a breath, I began running again. Then, a moment later, I stumbled onto a path, the path to the stream. For the first time I realized I was doing just what Brightman had told me, and why did that raise a doubt? But my desperation was still too intense to consider this question, and I merely followed the path until, just as he'd said, it joined up with the stream bed. Jumping down over the edge of the bank, which gave me the protection of a parapet, I finally stopped and turned around. Struggling to catch my breath, my face pressed to the scurf of dead grass along the top of the bank, I looked into the dark whirls of shadow that spread back into the forest. But there was nothing to see, and all I could hear was the rush of my breath in my throat and the whispering wind in the trees. I was safe, for the moment, but where was Subotin? What had happened to Brightman? What should I do? "He thinks you're me. Run. Stay in the stream." Now Brightman's words came back to me, and with them, cold as the shadows around me, a swirling mist of doubt. The same small doubt I'd felt in the cabin, but now 1,000 times magnified. Had I walked into a trap? All at once, every hint and fear and suspicion I'd felt these past weeks seemed to become crystal clear. I cursed, swore aloud, right there, staring back into the woods, my lips against the mud of the bank, for I was sure I understood now. Admitting the truth about my father let other truths in as well. Why had I been chosen to play Mary's protector? Because Brightman knew he could always control me. My father's guilt gave him an even greater hold over me than he'd had over Hamilton. But I'd gone too far, found out too much. That's why Brightman might have been forced to do a deal with Subotin. Two wily foxes joining their cunning, a deal whose final clause was my elimination. So Subotin had let me see him in Harrisburg. I'd been intended to follow him here. Yes, the ambush in the clearing had been designed for me to walk into, and now that I'd escaped, Brightman was trying to set up another. Stay in the stream. But almost as soon as I thought this, my mind jerked away. It couldn't be true. Brightman, coming out of his cabin when I'd first seen him, had not been a man expecting to hear a murderous shot. And May, could she do this? After what had passed between us on Hamilton's barge, I simply wasn't prepared to believe it. Besides, Brightman was probably right. Subotin didn't know who I was. He could have had no idea that I was in the cabin at all. Subotin thought I was Brightman. It was probably the only reason why I was still alive. Knowing Subotin's background, it was hard to believe that he could have missed me as I came out of the cabin door, despite the bad light. It was just too easy a shot. But he'd not been meaning to kill, only to frighten, because his main interest remained the money, and for that he needed Brightman alive. But why the stream? Why stay here? I looked around, curving through the trees. The stream bed was dark as a tunnel, except for the faint glitter from the trickle of water that still flowed along it. Yet the darkness made very thin cover. If he knew I was here, if he was watching, any man up on the bank would have a clear shot. My mind leapt back and forth, circuits of paranoia arcing through exhaustion and fear, and then, almost as if these mental currents had set it off, the detonating sound of a shot boomed through the darkness. Instinctively, I pressed myself flat, hugging the bank, yet even as the shot faded, I realized it was nowhere near here, and I found myself staring down the stream bed, back toward the cottage, back toward the road, if you went far enough. Logically, this should have increased my confusion, but in fact it decided me, and rolling onto my back, I skidded down the bank to the base of the stream bed. At this point, I don't know what I was thinking, or even if I was thinking at all, for as I headed along the stream, I was going in the direction of danger, toward the spot where the shot had come from. Perhaps I felt I had no choice, at least in that direction. I had the chance of reaching the road and my car, while going the other way would only carry me deeper into the bush. Or possibly I already suspected the injustice I might have done to Brightman, at least in my mind, and then with a terrible sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, I was almost certain of this. The deep boom of a second shot rolled up the stream bed toward me, and I knew this was the sound of a shotgun, not the rifle Subotin was carrying. Rather than setting a trap for me, Brightman was trying to draw him away from my trail. With a wrench of guilty desperation, I rushed on. It wasn't too hard. Right down at the water, the stream bed was gravel and hard-packed mud, and there was still just enough light to see by. A wedge of dusky light pressed down through the darkness of the forest around the stream, and high up there was the first opalescent glimmer of a moon. In a few minutes I'd reached a spot that must have been level with the cabin, though the building was in fact out of sight. I rested there listening, but after a moment, hearing nothing, I moved forward again. Soon I had no idea where I was. There were too many switchbacks and curves, and the dark hulking mass of the woods up in the bank made a featureless backdrop. Then, in succession, I ran into two obstacles. An enormous pine, undermined by the encroaching bank of the stream, had toppled across it. Its dead, brittle branches were as bad as barbed wire, and just beyond this the stream narrowed sharply, which, compressing the water, created a deep enough flow to force me up on the bank. Now, for a good 10 minutes I had to fight through brush in the pitch darkness which inevitably made a racket, and then the stream broadened, its flow fell back to the same meager trickle, and I was able to walk along the bed once again. 5 minutes later I stopped, knowing I must be close to the spot where the shot had come from. Thus, if Brightman had been giving me a chance to escape, I'd defeated his intention. But if that had been his intention, why had he told me to stay in the stream? Probably I should have been able to figure out the old man's plan at this point, but a moment later I didn't need to. Moving forward cautiously, I heard a slipping, sliding, scrabbling sound up ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a second I thought it might be an animal, but it came again, and I knew that it wasn't. Someone had skidded down the bank of the stream, Subotin or Brightman. I held my breath. In front of me, the stream bed stretched ahead into a black, dizzying void. Then stone knocked against stone, rattled away. Silence, the trickling stream, the wind rustling past. "Brightman, I know you are there, and your old blunderbuss doesn't frighten me at all." It was Subotin. It had to be. Standing just where I was, I slowly looked around. I was virtually in the middle of the stream, and the stream here was at its widest point. I couldn't reach either bank before he— "You see, there is no point. Don't try to hide. Come here. I won't hurt you, Brightman. You know that. For me, that makes no sense." More silence, the crunch of a footstep, then the glare of a flashlight. For a second I was dazzled, like a jack-lighted deer, but in fact the beam wasn't pointed toward me. It probed along the top edge of the opposite bank. Shadows leapt up and danced, and for an instant, as in an old photograph, the vague outlines of the bushes and trees were tipped with silver. Then the beam started moving. Wet stones and mud glistened and gleamed. The arc swept closer. I lifted the shotgun. A shot boomed through the darkness. At once the light died, but my finger still hadn't touched the trigger. The shot, a great red flash, had been fired from high up on the far bank. Brightman, it had to be, and then he fired again, a red flashing strobe that etched my shadow into the darkness. But he'd missed, for a quick burst of rifle fire exploded in front of me, and he sent me scrambling for cover. I lay, pressed down behind a small pile of rocks, more shots coming so fast they seemed to stumble over each other, wind up the stream bed. I could hear them slash through the bush, thump into the bank, but all on the far side of the stream from myself. And now I understood. Stay with the stream. And a feeling passed through me that I'd never felt before in my life. I had to kill a man now. There was no other choice. Brightman and I were both foxes now, and he was deliberately drawing the hound close to my teeth. What I needed was cover. These rocks weren't enough. If I missed with my first shot, he'd have me. The bank, but I'd make noise getting up there, and for an instant, going over the top, I'd be caught in silhouette from below. Then, as I listened to the stream, the simplest idea of all slipped into my mind. Quietly, running in a low crouch, I retraced my steps down the stream bed, hearing 2 more shots crackling behind me, until I'd reached the spot where the banks constricted. Here, after a bare slope of gravel, there was only the water itself. It was about 2 feet deep, flowing swiftly, bubbling over the stones. Silently, I stepped to the edge. The first touch was like ice. With the next, a steel band gripped my ankle. My foot skidded. I splashed, but the rush of the water covered it, and I kept going. In the middle, where the water reached up to my knees, I looked around. A few feet away, 3 bigger rocks formed a dam, a curve as neat as the back of a chair. Wading quietly toward them, I sat myself down. The shock of the cold was a kind of compression, a fierce grip on my chest, yet I had what I wanted, cover. Even if he'd been expecting me, he'd never look here. Scooping up mud from the bottom, I blackened my face. Now I was just another rock, a lump of dark in the lumpy black darkness. Even the fiercest hound wouldn't catch my scent here. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed. The cold, something concrete to struggle against, was almost a blessing. And then I thought that I saw him working along in a crouch on the far side. Or maybe I didn't, for nothing happened. I waited. Don't think. Hold your breath. Be the water, the stones, your reflection like syrup, your shadow a mist. And then he was there, and so close I almost jumped. A bulge in the darkness. I might have reached out and touched. I think he must have crawled the last yards flat on his belly. But now, slowly he rose. His shape disengaged itself from the shadows. He came up to the water. At the edge, he stepped out onto a stone, 12 feet, no more. One step, only one single more step. The barrel of my gun was actually under the surface, the action and butt resting on my flexed knee. One motion. Don't think. Do it. Do it. Up and point, and squeeze the front trigger. Did Brightman know I was there? Had he seen me? Or did he just sense me? Or perhaps Subotin himself, the old fox now, turning the tables and scenting the hound? I never found out. Afterward, there was no time to ask. But even as my finger tensed on the trigger, a shot erupted high on the bank. I think he must have fired into the air. Certainly he didn't come close to Subotin, but if he'd been trying to draw the other man out, he couldn't have done any better. Because Subotin now flashed on his light. Its beam traced a brilliant path through the darkness, sparkling on the water, glistening lustrously across the wet stones, and turning his face into a smooth silver mask. And that's when I fired. Once. Then again. For a split second an image was burned into my retina. The banks of the stream, the water rushing up to my chest, the man tumbling back, his arms outflung. Then there was only the echo, a vague red pulse before my eyes, and I was staggering up, stumbling and splashing in horror. "Thorn, is that you? Are you all right?" "Yes. Don't shoot." My voice, that strangled sound, it had to belong to somebody else. I was dazed and I was freezing and trembling all over. Brightman came down the bank, clattering over the stones. I only hoped you understood what I meant. He didn't know there were two of us, I was certain, but I didn't hear anything more. I was staring down at this bloody shape in the water. The current bubbled around him, eddying against the curve of his shoulders, bobbed his head on the surface, splayed out his arms. And this time I could not look away, could not retch, could not even spit the foul taste from my mouth. For the shot, whose echo had now faded in the night, air could only summon another, and the sight in front of my eyes was merely a memory made real. Coming up, seeing me, Brightman must have understood this, for I'm sure his words were meant only to comfort. They could hardly be revenge for the dark thoughts I'd had about him, but their kindness delivered the only blow I wasn't expecting. "Thorn, I did all I could, I swear. That afternoon we tried everything, your mother and I, but nothing we said, nothing we did could—" I looked at him in horror. "We? What do you mean?" "Would I say we?" But then his face turned aghast. "I assumed you knew that. They were in it together, your mother and father, both of them, from the very beginning."